1,000 square miles of ocean.
The New York Times under fire after a leaked transcript from a town hall meeting between the executive editor and its employees, showing the publication discussing the evolution of how to cover the president. Jill Abramson is the author of the book Merchants of Truth and the former executive editor of the New York Times, and she joins us now live. Jill, good morning to you, and thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It's great to have the ability to chat with you in the wake of several controversies that the New York Times is facing. But first, if you could just comment on your thoughts after your time in the newsroom on how the paper is covering the news today.
Well, I think that Dean Baquet, the executive editor who presided over that internal meeting, is really doing a brilliant job. And I think under circumstances in terms of covering the White House that were more difficult than when I was executive editor, because let's face it, he's criticized all the time by you and Fox News and by conservatives for, being way too hard on Trump and being biased against him. And yet its readership, which is quite liberal, wants the paper to be even tougher on President Trump. And in the meeting, I was impressed because I thought Dean Baquet had it exactly right in explaining to his staff that the job of the New York Times is first and foremost to be independent and to hold power accountable and to report the news accurately.
But essentially, he told...
not everybody inside the Times was thrilled about hearing that, but I think that's exactly right.
Essentially, he told reporters and staffers that we started, I hope you can hear me, that we started, trying to cover the Trump-Russia collusion narrative, and that's kind of gone away. So now we're going to cover President Trump as a racist. Is that essentially what he says? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I think you mischaracterize what he said. What he was explaining is that the paper had been set up to cover a deep investigative story out of Washington, and that now they were pivoting to coverage of a general election where the job of the New York Times is to be out in the country figuring out how people feel and what they think. It was not telling people, get ready to cover a racist administration. That is a complete mischaracterization of what he was saying.
But isn't that a characterization?
I've read that transcript twice.
But isn't that an allegation? Let me read you a piece of that transcript, and we also have taken the opportunity to read through that as well, where he is questioned, Dean Baquet, by his staffers pretty aggressively in that meeting. Here's a bit of it. And this is Dean Baquet's words. We built our newsroom to cover one story, and we did it truly well. Now we have to regroup and shift resources and emphasis to take on a different story. It is a story that requires deep investigation into people who peddle hatred, but it is also a story that requires imaginative use of all our muscles to write about race and class in a deeper way than we have in years. That is the point at which it was really criticized. You heard some members of Congress, including Ted Cruz and others, speaking out pretty aggressively about that, revealing an intentional shift in coverage, Jill, from the Russia narrative to now race in covering the president. Is that fair?
I think that's an overstatement. I think if you look at the totality of what Dean said, he was urging his staff to make a pivot to cover out in the country, in all America, not just in Washington, like how people are feeling, to understand deeply why they elected Donald Trump in 2016 and why they possibly may do so again in 2016, to really get in touch with the country. And that will involve, for sure, understanding why white nationalism is on the rise, why we have seen some racist incidents. I think that is what he was doing if you look at the full transcript.
Jill, I know you were critical of the changing headline story. This was another controversy in recent weeks that the New York Times faced. And that was a headline that the New York Times put out after the president spoke publicly after 2 mass shootings took place. Mm-hmm. The headline originally read this: Trump urges unity versus racism. Well, many staffers, many readers and subscribers spoke out quickly about that headline. They did not see that as an accurate portrayal of the president's words. The New York Times bowed to that pressure, changed the headline to assailing hate but not guns. The headline was factual to start off, was it not? And why did the New York Times change that?
Well, I mean, it was perhaps factual, but it didn't really carry the full context of the moment in which the president was giving his speech. And I don't think the Times changed the headline simply in reaction to online criticism and a tweet storm.
Why else would they?
Backfired has explained that the editors themselves looked at the headline when it went up and thought, this is a bad headline. This doesn't give the right context.
Those were his words. He called it a bad headline.
They weren't simply reacting to mass criticism. Look, when I was an executive editor, I changed headlines because sometimes they were off, sometimes they missed nuances, sometimes they had errors in them. And, it isn't done all the time, but it's not, a huge, surprising event, and I don't think they were doing it
Jill,
in
finally,
reaction to all the criticism.
And I'm sorry to cut you off. We're running short on time here, but I want to get this in here because we have seen you critical of the Times coverage. This dates back to a year ago, June 2018, when you tweeted this. I believe that was the date, where you talked about the New York Times missing Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez rise in the news and the way that the Times was covering it. These are your words. Kind of irks me, for lack of saying that word on the air, that the New York Times is still asking who is Ocasio-Cortez when it should have covered her campaign, missing her rise akin to not seeing Trump's win coming in 2016. In that moment, you said that it was time for the New York Times to change course. Do you believe they have?
Well, I think that the course of the New York Times has always been to cover the news. And when a candidate that they had not covered comes and wins and they haven't written one news story about her before the election, that isn't covering the news. And that's what I was criticizing. And yes, it wasn't just the New York Times that missed Trump's building victory on election night 2016. It was pretty much the whole news media that decided Hillary Clinton was going to be elected. And that's because they weren't really out in the country talking to voters and figuring out how people really felt and which way the election was turning.
It's no secret, Joe. I'll say that most people do view the New York Times. I don't know if that's a fair characterization. Let me rephrase that question.
I don't think most people.
So you obviously know where I'm going with the question. In this day, and I know that your book writes about old school journalism and the changing media landscape,
right,
and what is missing from journalism today. And I'll just ask you: does the New York Times fairly cover the news? Does the New York Times fairly cover President Trump?
I think it does fairly cover President Trump, who makes it very difficult to cover him. I mean, how do you cover a president who, according to the Washington Post just this week, has more than 10,000, has said more than 10,000 falsehoods or misstatements or outright lies? It is extremely difficult. But Dean Baquet and A.G. Sulzberger, the publisher, have said many times that it is not the job of the Times to be the opposition party. And, you know, they try mightily to make sure that it isn't, even though the president's supporters view it as such.
Jill Abramson, the former executive editor at the New York Times. Good to have you on.
Thank you, Jill.
Oh, thanks for having me.
All right.
A new immigration policy closing a catch